The gunshot echoed across the mountain valley like thunder, and Sarah Carter threw herself behind the overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs as splinters of wood exploded around her. The men who had been hunting her for 3 days had finally found her hiding place, and now there was nowhere left to run. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed her back against the rough wooden planks, feeling the cold mountain air bite through her torn dress. Behind her, she could hear Anthony Morgan's steady breathing, his presence both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. The wealthy mountain man who had found her eating scraps from his garbage just 2 weeks ago now stood between her and certain death, his rifle raised toward the tree line where muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the gathering dusk. But to understand how Sarah Carter came to be crouched behind that wagon, fighting for her life alongside a man she barely knew yet trusted completely, we must go back to the beginning, to that cold October evening when hunger had driven her to desperate measures and changed the course of both their lives forever. The autumn wind cut through the mountain passes like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter and the scent of snow from the high peaks. Sarah Carter pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the dense pine forest, her worn boots making barely a whisper on the carpet of fallen needles. She had been walking for days now, living on whatever berries and roots she could find, her stomach a constant ache that seemed to grow worse with each passing hour. The small pouch of coins she had managed to save before fleeing her old life was long gone, spent on a single meal in a night's shelter in the last town she had dared to enter. Now, as darkness began to settle over the mountains like a heavy blanket, Sarah found herself drawn by the warm glow of light spilling from the windows of a large cabin nestled in a clearing ahead. Smoke rose from its stone chimney in a steady column, and she could smell something wonderful cooking inside, something that made her mouth water and her empty stomach clench with longing. The cabin was larger than any she had seen in these mountains, built from massive logs that spoke of wealth and permanence. A well-tended garden stretched along one side, now brown and dormant with the season's end, and several outbuildings dotted the property. This was clearly the home of someone with means, someone who could afford to live comfortably even in this remote wilderness. A man sat alone at a large wooden table, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the firelight as he ate his evening meal. Even from her hiding place, Sarah could see that he was well dressed, his clothes clean and well made, his dark hair neatly trimmed. This had to be Anthony Morgan, the wealthy recluse she had heard whispered about in the last settlement. But Sarah was far past the point of decent choices. Her hunger had become a living thing inside her, gnawing at her resolve and clouding her judgment. When she saw him rise from the table and disappear into another room, leaving his half-finished meal sitting there in the golden lamplight, something inside her snapped. The back of the cabin faced the forest, and Sarah found herself creeping toward what appeared to be a small lean-to structure attached to the main building. As she drew closer, she realized it was where household refuse was kept, and her heart sank as she caught sight of several wooden buckets and barrels arranged beneath the shelter. The smell that reached her was not entirely unpleasant, a mixture of food scraps and kitchen waste that spoke of regular, abundant meals. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before desperation overrode her pride. She approached the nearest bucket and peered inside, her stomach clenching as she saw the remnants of what must have been a feast by her current standards. Pieces of bread, some still soft and barely touched, chunks of meat with fat still clinging to the bone, vegetables that had been discarded for minor imperfections. She reached into the bucket with trembling hands, pulling out a piece of bread that was only slightly stale around the edges. The first bite was like heaven, and she had to fight back tears as she chewed. She was reaching for another piece when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find herself staring into the dark eyes of Anthony Morgan. He stood there in the doorway of the lean-to, a tall figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the cabin behind him. Sarah's heart stopped, and she felt the bread turn to ash in her mouth as she waited for him to shout, to call for help, to drive her away into the cold night. Instead, he simply stood there, studying her with an expression she could not read. Sarah tried to scramble to her feet, the piece of bread falling from her nerveless fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind in the pines. "I didn't mean. I was just so hungry." And I thought, Anthony Morgan continued to study her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her tangled hair, the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of too many days without proper food or shelter. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, with none of the anger she had expected. When did you last eat a real meal? The question caught her off guard, and she found herself answering honestly despite her fear. 4 days ago, maybe 5, I've lost track. He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. And where are you headed? Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then realized she had no answer to give. I don't know, she admitted. Anthony Morgan was quiet for another moment, and Sarah could hear the wind picking up, rattling the branches of the pines. When he spoke again, his words were the last thing she expected to hear. Let's eat together tonight. Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? I said, let's eat together tonight. He gestured toward the cabin behind him. I was just finishing my supper when I heard someone outside. There's plenty, and it seems you could use a proper meal. The offer was so unexpected that Sarah could only stand there gaping at him. I can't pay you, she managed to say. Did I ask you to pay? There was something almost like amusement in his dark eyes. Come inside before you freeze to death. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to be cautious. But the alternative was returning to the cold forest, to hunger and the very real possibility of not surviving the night. And there was something in his manner that made her want to trust him. Wei-bei, she asked, needing to understand his motivation. Anthony Morgan considered the question seriously before answering. Because everyone deserves to eat dinner with dignity, he said simply, and because I know what it's like to be hungry. The inside of the cabin was spacious and well-appointed, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and comfortable furniture arranged throughout. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and Sarah caught glimpses of expensive artwork hanging in the shadows beyond the firelight. Anthony gestured toward a chair at the large wooden table. Sit, he said, moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. I'll bring you a plate. Sarah sank into the indicated chair, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Anthony returned carrying a plate piled high with food that made Sarah's mouth water. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with butter melting into golden pools, green beans that still steamed, fresh bread with a crust that crackled when he set it down. Go ahead, he said, settling back into his own chair across from her. Eat. Sarah picked up the fork with trembling hands and began to eat. The first bite of chicken was so good, so perfectly seasoned and tender, that she forgot about everything else. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but as the food hit her empty stomach, she found herself eating faster. Anthony watched her eat without comment, occasionally taking a bite of his own meal, but mostly just observing her with those dark, unreadable eyes. When she finally slowed down, he refilled her water glass and pushed a basket of bread closer to her side of the table. Better? He asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. What's your name? Anthony asked, his voice gentle. Sarah, she replied, then added almost automatically, Sarah Carter. I'm Anthony Morgan, he said, and you're welcome to stay the night if you need to. There's a guest room upstairs, and it looks like there's weather coming in. As if summoned by his words, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and Sarah could hear the first drops of what sounded like sleet beginning to fall on the roof. I don't understand, she said, setting down her fork and looking at him directly. Why are you being kind to me? You don't know anything about me. Anthony smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. Could you be dangerous? He asked, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. Sarah looked down at herself, taking in her torn dress, her too thin frame. I suppose not, she admitted. As for why I'm being kind, Anthony continued, let's just say I believe in treating people the way I would want to be treated if our positions were reversed. The accuracy of his observation hit her like a physical blow, and Sarah felt tears spring into her eyes despite her efforts to maintain her composure. She had indeed had more than enough unkindness, more than enough cruelty and indifference and casual brutality. I should tell you, she said, feeling she owed him some explanation. I'm not just traveling through, I'm running from something. Someone. If you help me, you might be putting yourself in danger. Anthony considered this information with the same serious attention he had given everything else. Are you a criminal? He asked. No, Ma. Did you hurt someone who didn't deserve it? No. Then I'm not particularly concerned about who might be looking for you, he said. This is my mountain, and I don't take kindly to uninvited visitors who come here meaning harm. The storm outside was picking up intensity, and Sarah could hear the wind howling around the cabin's eaves. She was deeply grateful to be sitting in the warm, well-lit room rather than huddled somewhere in the forest. Tell me about yourself, Anthony said. What brings you to my mountain? Sarah hesitated, unsure how much she wanted to reveal. But something about Anthony's manner made her want to be honest with him. I was married, she began slowly, to a man in Denver, Robert Brown. He seemed kind when he was courting me, generous and attentive. My father had died and I had no other family, so when Robert offered marriage, I thought it was the answer to my problems. She paused, taking a sip of water to steady herself. Anthony waited patiently. It wasn't long after the wedding that I realized I had made a terrible mistake, she continued. Robert wasn't kind at all. He was controlling, possessive, and when he drank, which was often, he became violent. I tried to leave several times, but he always found me and brought me back. He had connections, money, influence. No one would help me. Anthony's expression had grown darker as she spoke, and Sarah could see anger building in his eyes, though she sensed it was not directed at her. The last time I tried to leave, he beat me so badly I couldn't walk for a week, Sarah said, her voice growing quieter. When I recovered, I realized that if I stayed, he was eventually going to kill me. So I waited until he went on one of his business trips, took what little money I could find, and ran. That was 3 weeks ago. And he's looking for you, Anthony said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he's hired men to find me and bring me back. I've been staying ahead of them so far, but they're persistent. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the hearth. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was an underlying hardness to it. You're safe here, he said simply. For as long as you need to be. You don't understand, Sarah protested. These aren't just local thugs. Robert has money, and he's willing to spend it to get what he wants. Neither am I, Anthony replied, and something in his tone made Sarah believe him completely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Sarah found herself studying her host, trying to understand what kind of man would offer sanctuary to a complete stranger. What about you? Sarah asked eventually. What brings a man like you to live alone on a mountain? Anthony smiled, but there was sadness in it. Sometimes the place that seems most isolated is actually the most peaceful, Anthony said. I spent years in cities, in the company of people who claimed to be friends, but were really only interested in what I could do for them. I made my money in silver mining, but the business world is full of sharks. Eventually, I decided I preferred the honest danger of mountain lions and bears to the hidden knives of so-called civilized society. Sarah nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. Sometimes the wilderness is safer than the world of people. Exactly. Anthony stood and began clearing the dishes from the table. But enough heavy conversation for one evening. You look exhausted, and that storm isn't going to let up anytime soon. Let me show you to the guest room. Sarah followed him up a set of stairs that led to the cabin's second floor. The guest room he showed her to was comfortable and well-appointed, with a large bed covered in handmade quilts, a dresser with a mirror, and a window that looked out over the forest. There are some women's clothes in the dresser, he said, somewhat awkwardly. They belonged to my sister. She used to visit sometimes before. He trailed off, then shook his head. Anyway, they're there if you need them. Thank you, Sarah said, and meant it more than any thanks she had ever given in her life. After he left, Sarah stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, hardly able to believe her circumstances had changed so dramatically. A few hours ago, she had been cold, hungry, and desperate. Now she was warm, fed, and safe, at least for the night. She explored the dresser and found that Anthony's sister had indeed left behind a selection of women's clothing. Sarah selected a nightgown and a dress for the following day, both of which looked like they would fit her reasonably well. As she cleaned herself and changed into the borrowed nightgown, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her was thin and hollow-eyed, with bruises that had faded to yellow-green shadows on her arms and throat. But there was something else in her reflection, something she had not seen in months. For the first time since she had fled Denver, she looked like a person rather than a hunted animal. Sarah slept better that night than she had in weeks, despite the storm that continued to rage outside. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and the world outside sparkled with fresh snow that had fallen during the night. She dressed in the borrowed clothes and made her way downstairs to find Anthony already up and moving around the kitchen. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and Sarah's stomach reminded her that despite the generous meal the night before, she was still recovering from weeks of inadequate nutrition. "Good morning," Anthony said, looking up from the stove. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Sarah replied honestly. "Thank you again for everything." "Sit," Anthony said, gesturing toward the table. "Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes." Through the windows, she could see that the storm had transformed the landscape into a winter wonderland, with snow covering the pine boughs and icicles hanging from the eaves. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing out at the pristine scene. "It's also going to make travel difficult for a while," Anthony observed, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of her. "The road down the mountain will be impassable until this melts." Sarah felt a moment of panic at the thought of being trapped. "How long do you think that will be?" "Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be a week or more. Depends on the weather." Anthony sat down across from her. "Does that worry you?" "I don't want to impose on your hospitality," Sarah said, though part of her was relieved at the prospect of having to stay. "You're not imposing," Anthony assured her. "I don't get much company up here, and I have to admit it's nice to have someone to talk to." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she had not been able to do in months. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said as they finished their meal. "Of course." "Yesterday, when you found me eating from your garbage, you weren't surprised. It was almost like you were expecting it. Why?" Anthony was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I've been watching you for 3 days," he said finally. Sarah's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Watching me? You've been circling the area, staying in the forest, but never venturing too far from the cabin. I could see you were hungry, desperate, but still trying to avoid contact with people. I figured eventually you'd either approach directly or try to find food some other way. And you just waited to see what I would do?" "I wanted to see what kind of person you were," Anthony explained. "Someone truly dangerous would have tried to break in, or would have approached with demands or threats, but you were clearly trying not to be seen, trying not to cause trouble. That told me something about your character." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside, the distant but unmistakable noise of horses making their way through the snow. Anthony's expression immediately became alert, and he stood up from the table, moving toward the window to peer out at the forest. "Expecting someone?" Sarah asked, though the sudden tension in the room told her the answer. "No," Anthony said grimly, "and anyone coming out here in this weather is either very determined or very foolish." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications hit her. "They found me," she whispered. Anthony moved away from the window and toward a cabinet that contained several rifles and what looked like enough ammunition to outfit a small army. "How many men did your husband hire?" Anthony asked, his voice calm and businesslike as he selected a rifle and began checking its action. "I don't know for sure," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "At least 3, maybe more." The sound of horses was getting closer now, and Sarah could make out individual voices calling to each other through the trees. "Sarah," Anthony said, and something in his tone made her look at him directly. "I meant what I said last night. You're safe here, but I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Good. Go upstairs to the guest room and stay away from the windows. If shooting starts, get on the floor and stay there until I come for you." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to have a conversation with your visitors," Anthony said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah think it was not going to be the kind of conversation that ended with handshakes. From the upstairs window, she could see 3 men on horseback emerging from the tree line. They were bundled in heavy coats against the cold, but she could see they were well armed and had the look of men accustomed to violence. She watched as Anthony stepped out onto the cabin's front porch, the rifle held casually in his hands, but clearly visible to the approaching riders. Even from her vantage point upstairs, Sarah could see that he appeared completely calm and unafraid. The lead rider, a tall man with a dark beard, raised his hand in what might have been intended as a friendly greeting. "Morning, Nakai," he called out as the group came to a stop about 20 yards from the porch. "We're looking for someone, and we heard you might have seen her." "I see a lot of things," Anthony replied, his voice carrying clearly in the cold mountain air. "What makes you think I'd want to share any of it with strangers?" The bearded man's smile faltered slightly at Anthony's response, but he pressed on. "We're looking for a woman about 25 years old, brown hair, might be traveling alone. Her name is Sarah Carter, and her husband is very worried about her. Worried enough to hire armed men to track her down in a snowstorm," Anthony observed dryly. "That's some serious concern." The second rider, a younger man with pale eyes that made Sarah shiver, urged his horse forward. "Look, friend, we're not looking for trouble. We just want to find the woman and take her home where she belongs." "Where she belongs," Anthony repeated, and Sarah could hear the edge creeping into his voice. "Interesting way to put it. Makes her sound more like property than a person." The bearded man held up a hand to quiet his companion. "We're authorized to offer a substantial reward for information leading to her whereabouts," he said, reaching into his coat. $500 for anyone who can tell us where to find her." Anthony didn't move, didn't show any reaction to the offer. "And if I told you I hadn't seen any woman matching that description, then we'd thank you for your time and be on our way," the bearded man said, though something in his tone suggested that might not be entirely true. "But you don't believe that's the case, do you?" Anthony asked. The third rider, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "We tracked her this far before the storm hit. She's somewhere in this area, and yours is the only cabin for miles." "Well then," Anthony said, and Sarah could hear the change in his voice even from upstairs. "I guess we have a problem." The bearded man's hand moved toward his gun, but he stopped when Anthony raised his rifle slightly. "I don't think you understand the situation here," the bearded man said, his friendly facade finally dropping away. "We know she's here. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way we're taking her with us. The only thing you're going to take with you is my advice to get off my property while you still can," Anthony replied calmly. The pale-eyed man laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "3 against 1, old man. I like those odds." "Do you, bud?" Anthony asked, and something in his tone made even the pale-eyed man's laughter die away. "Because I'm thinking you boys don't know much about mountain warfare. See, up here, the man who knows the terrain has all the advantages." The bearded man was studying Anthony with new attention. "You're Anthony Morgan," he said suddenly. "I am." "I heard you were dead." "Greatly exaggerated," Anthony replied, "though it's about to become a lot less exaggerated for some people if they don't get off my mountain." The pale-eyed man was growing agitated, his hand hovering near his gun. "I don't care who he is. We have a job to do." "Yes, you do," Anthony agreed. "Your job is to leave. Now." The bearded man seemed to be weighing his options, studying Anthony and the cabin and the surrounding terrain. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "We'll be back," he said, pulling his horse's reins to turn away from the cabin. "With more men." "I'll be waiting," Anthony replied. The 3 men rode back into the forest, but Sarah could see that they were not going far. They would be back, probably sooner rather than later, and next time they would come prepared for a fight. Anthony waited until the riders had disappeared before lowering his rifle and coming back inside. Sarah met him at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale with fear and guilt. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I never wanted to bring this to your door." "You're not going anywhere," Anthony said firmly. "And you have nothing to apologize for. Those men made their choice when they decided to come onto my property making threats. But there are 3 of them, and the leader said they'd be back with war. You can't fight an army by yourself." Anthony smiled, and there was something in that smile that reminded Sarah that this man had not become wealthy by being weak or unprepared. "Who says I'll be by myself?" Anthony moved toward a large wooden chest that sat in one corner of the main room. When he opened it, Sarah saw that it contained more weapons than she had realized one person could own, along with what looked like enough supplies to withstand a siege. "I told you I made my money in mining," Anthony said, selecting several items from the chest. "What I didn't mention is that silver mining in this territory 20 years ago was not a business for the faint of heart." He handed Sarah a small pistol, showing her how to load and fire it. "I hope you won't need this, but it's better to have it and not need it than the other way around." "I don't know how to shoot," Sarah protested. "It's not difficult at close range," Anthony assured her. "Point it at what you want to hit and pull the trigger. But only if someone gets past me, which I don't intend to let happen." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Anthony moved through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, checking weapons, positioning supplies, and preparing defensive positions. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the men who had come looking for her were not going to give up easily. Anthony spotted movement in the trees several times, and it was obvious that they were being watched. "They're waiting for dark," Anthony explained as he checked the action on another rifle. "They think it will give them an advantage." "Will it?" Sarah asked. Anthony's smile was not entirely pleasant. "They're about to find out that some advantages work both ways." The first shot came just after full darkness fell, shattering one of the cabin's front windows and sending glass flying across the main room. Anthony had been expecting it, had positioned them both behind heavy furniture that would provide cover, but the sudden violence still made Sarah's heart leap into her throat. "Stay down," Anthony commanded, and then he was moving, returning fire through the broken window with calm precision. The battle for Sarah's freedom had begun. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced, a deadly dance of muzzle flashes and thunderous reports that echoed off the mountain walls. Anthony moved through his own cabin with fluid grace, appearing at windows to return fire before disappearing back into cover, always staying one step ahead of the bullets that sought him. Sarah crouched behind the heavy wooden table Anthony had overturned for her protection, clutching the pistol he had given her and trying to make herself as small as possible. The sound of gunfire was overwhelming in the confined space, and she could smell gunpowder and splintered wood. "How many do you count?" Anthony called out during a brief lull in the shooting. Sarah forced herself to peek over the edge of the table toward the windows. "I see at least 5 different positions," she called back. "Maybe more." "They brought friends," Anthony observed grimly, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. Another volley of shots shattered what remained of the front windows, and Sarah heard Anthony curse as splinters exploded from the wall near his head. She realized with growing horror that despite his confidence and in preparation, they were badly outnumbered. "Anthony," as she called out during another brief pause, "there are too many of them. Maybe I should surrender." "The only person who's going to get killed tonight is someone who tries to take you from this cabin," Anthony replied, and there was steel in his voice. "These men came here with violence in mind. They made their choice." Sarah heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere toward the back of the cabin. Someone was trying to get in through another window. "Behind us," she hissed, pointing toward the sound. Anthony nodded and handed her another loaded rifle. "Can you watch the front windows? Just shoot at any muzzle flash you see. You don't have to hit anything, just keep them honest." Sarah took the rifle with trembling hands, positioning herself where she could see out the shattered front windows. Almost immediately, she saw a flash of movement in the tree line and fired instinctively. She had no idea if she hit anything, but the movement stopped. Behind her, she could hear Anthony moving toward the back of the cabin, and then the distinctive sound of his rifle firing at close range. Someone screamed in pain and rage, and she heard the crash of a body falling through what sounded like a window. "One down," Anthony called out, but there was no satisfaction in his voice, only grim determination. The men outside seemed to realize that their flanking maneuver had failed because the intensity of fire from the front increased dramatically. Sarah found herself firing repeatedly at muzzle flashes, working the rifle's action as Anthony had shown her. The battle continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah lost track of how many shots she fired, focusing only on survival, on keeping the men outside from getting close enough to rush the cabin. Then suddenly the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the gunfire had been. broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing and the distant wail of wind through the pine trees. "Anthony?" she called out softly. "I'm here," came his voice from somewhere near the back of the cabin. "Stay down. They might be regrouping." Sarah remained crouched behind her overturned table, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate the attackers were preparing another assault. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then she heard it, the sound of someone moving carefully through the snow outside, trying to approach the cabin without being detected. The footsteps were coming from the side of the building. "Someone's coming from the east side," she whispered. "I hear them," he replied, and she could tell from his voice that he was moving to intercept the threat. The footsteps stopped directly outside what Sarah knew was the kitchen window, and she held her breath. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then the night exploded into violence again as someone smashed through the kitchen window and began firing wildly into the cabin. Sarah heard Anthony return fire, and then a cry of pain that might have come from either man. Her heart clenched with terror at the thought that Anthony might have been hit, and without thinking about the danger to herself, she left her position behind the table and moved toward the kitchen. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Anthony was on the ground, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder, while one of the attackers stood over him with a gun pointed at his head. The man was the pale-eyed rider from earlier, and his face was twisted with rage and pain from what looked like a wound of his own. "Drop the rifle," the man snarled when he saw Sarah appear in the doorway, "or I put a bullet in his brain." Sarah froze, the rifle heavy in her hands, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do. Anthony was looking at her with those dark eyes, and she could see him trying to tell her something without speaking. "I said drop it!" the pale-eyed man screamed, pressing the barrel of his gun against Anthony's temple. Sarah let the rifle fall from her nerveless fingers. The pale-eyed man smiled, an expression of pure malice. "That's better," he said. "Now you're going to come with me, nice and quiet, and maybe I won't kill your friend here." "Sarah, don't!" Anthony managed to say through gritted teeth. "He's going to kill me anyway." "Shut up!" the pale-eyed man snarled, kicking Anthony in the ribs. Sarah took a step forward, her hands raised to show she was no longer armed. "Let him go," she said. "I'll come with you willingly if you just let him go." "You'll come with me anyway," the man replied. "The only question is whether he dies quick or slow." That was when Sarah remembered the small pistol Anthony had given her earlier, the one she had tucked into the waistband of her borrowed dress. Moving as slowly and carefully as she could, she began to ease her hand toward the weapon. "Don't even think about it," the pale-eyed man warned, but he was focused on Anthony, probably thinking the greater threat came from the wounded man on the floor. Sarah's fingers closed around the pistol's grip, and she pulled it free in one smooth motion, pointing it at the pale-eyed man's chest. Her hand was shaking, but at this range it didn't matter. "Let him go," she said again, and this time there was steel in her voice. The pale-eyed man laughed. "You don't have the guts to pull that trigger, lady. You're not a killer." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed, "but I'm learning." She pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the kitchen, and the pale-eyed man staggered backward, a look of shock replacing the malicious confidence that had been on his face just moments before. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then back at Sarah, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "You shot me," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "Yes," Sarah replied, keeping the pistol trained on him. "I did." The pale-eyed man tried to raise his own weapon, but his strength was failing, and the gun slipped from his fingers to clatter on the kitchen floor. He took another step backward, stumbled, and fell through the broken window he had used to enter the cabin, disappearing into the darkness outside. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty window frame, hardly able to believe what she had just done. She had never hurt another person in her life, had never even imagined herself capable of such violence. But when faced with the choice between Anthony's life and her own moral qualms, she had not hesitated. "Sarah," Anthony's voice brought her back to the present, and she quickly moved to kneel beside him, examining his wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing anything vital but causing significant blood loss. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, tearing strips from her borrowed dress to use as bandages. Later, Anthony said, struggling to sit up despite her protests. We need to make sure there aren't any more of them out there first. As if in answer to his words, they heard the sound of horses moving through the forest, growing more distant rather than closer. It seemed that the remaining attackers had decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They're leaving, Sarah said, relief flooding through her voice. For now, Anthony agreed grimly, but they'll be back, probably with even more men. Sarah finished binding Anthony's wound as best she could with the makeshift bandages, then helped him to his feet. He was pale from blood loss but steady enough to walk. And together they made their way back to the main room of the cabin to survey the damage. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation. Windows were shattered, furniture was overturned and splintered by bullets, and the walls were pocked with holes. The comfortable, welcoming home that had been her sanctuary just hours before now looked like a war zone. I'm so sorry, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the destruction. Your beautiful home. I've ruined everything. Houses can be repaired, Anthony said simply. People are harder to fix. He moved to the gun cabinet and began selecting weapons and ammunition. We can't stay here, he continued. They know exactly where to find us, and next time they'll come prepared for a real fight. Where can we go? Sarah asked. You said yourself that the roads are impassable. There are other ways off this mountain, Anthony replied, trails that most people don't know about, but we'll have to travel light and move fast. Sarah nodded, understanding that their brief respite was over. But as she watched him prepare for their flight, she realized that something fundamental had changed during the battle they had just survived. She was no longer the terrified, helpless woman who had been reduced to eating scraps from a garbage bin. The woman who had shot an armed man to save Anthony's life was someone different, someone stronger. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. What do you need me to do? She asked. Anthony looked at her with something like approval in his dark eyes. Pack light but warm, food, water, ammunition. We'll be traveling rough country in winter weather. Sarah moved quickly to gather the supplies they would need, her mind already focused on the challenges ahead rather than dwelling on the violence they had just survived. Ready? Anthony asked, shouldering a pack that looked heavy despite his injury. Ready, Sarah replied, and meant it. They slipped out of the back of the cabin into the cold mountain night, moving as quietly as possible through the snow-covered forest. Anthony led the way, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound through the trees toward the higher elevations. Sarah stayed close behind him, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The pistol that had saved both their lives now tucked securely in her coat pocket. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, with hidden roots and rocks that threatened to trip them with every step. Snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, but also making the footing even more uncertain. Sarah's borrowed boots were not designed for this kind of travel, and she could feel the cold seeping through the leather to numb her feet. But she pressed on without complaint, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on reaching safety before their pursuers could regroup and continue the hunt. Behind them, the warm glow of Anthony's cabin windows grew smaller and smaller until it was lost entirely among the dark trees. They traveled in silence for what felt like hours, climbing steadily into the higher elevations where the air grew thinner and the cold more bitter. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath, and her legs ached from the constant upward climb. But she forced herself to keep pace with Anthony despite his injury. Finally, when Sarah thought she could not take another step, Anthony called a halt in a small clearing protected by a ring of massive pine trees. The snow was not as deep here, and there was some shelter from the wind. We'll rest here for a few hours, Anthony said, his voice betraying the exhaustion he had been hiding. But we can't risk a fire. It would be visible for miles. Sarah sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her entire body aching from the unaccustomed exertion. The cold was intense without the warmth of movement to keep it at bay. How much farther? She asked. To where we're going? Another day's hard travel, maybe more in this weather. Anthony settled beside her on the log. There's an old mining camp about 10 miles from here. Abandoned for years, but still habitable. Sarah nodded, too tired to do more than accept his plan. She found herself leaning against Anthony's uninjured shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For everything. For taking me in, for protecting me, for risking your life for someone you barely know. Anthony was quiet for a moment. You know, when I found you eating from my garbage that first night, I saw something in your eyes that I recognized. The look of someone who had been pushed to the breaking point but refused to break. That takes a special kind of strength. I don't feel strong, Sarah admitted. I feel scared and lost. Strength isn't about not being scared, Anthony replied. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And you've done that repeatedly. Tonight, when you shot that man to save my life, that took more courage than most people possess. Sarah thought about this as they sat in the cold darkness, listening to the wind sigh through the pine boughs above them. Perhaps strength was not about never falling down, but about getting back up each time you did. The abandoned mining camp Anthony had spoken of turned out to be more substantial than Sarah had expected. Hidden in a narrow valley between two steep ridges, the collection of weathered buildings had been constructed to last, with solid log walls and stone foundations that had withstood years of mountain weather. Anthony led her to what had once been the mine supervisor's cabin, a sturdy structure that was larger and better appointed than the workers' quarters that surrounded it. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Anthony produced a key from somewhere in his pack. I bought this entire claim years ago, he explained as he unlocked the door. Thought I might work it someday, but never got around to it. I've been using it as a kind of emergency retreat ever since. The interior of the cabin was cold and dusty, but dry and well-preserved. Anthony had clearly stocked it with supplies at some point, because Sarah could see canned goods, blankets, and other necessities arranged on shelves along the walls. A large stone fireplace dominated one end of the room, and Anthony immediately began building a fire. Is it safe to have a fire? Sarah asked, remembering his earlier warning about the light being visible. This valley is hidden from most directions, Anthony assured her, as flames began to lick at the kindling. And we're far enough from the main trails that casual travelers won't spot the smoke. The warmth from the growing fire was like a blessing, and Sarah moved as close to it as she dared, holding her hands out to the flames and feeling sensations slowly return to her numb fingers. Anthony rummaged through the supplies and produced a coffee pot and the makings of a simple meal, and soon the cabin was filled with the comforting smells of coffee and bacon. As they ate, Sarah found herself studying Anthony's face in the firelight, trying to understand this man who had risked everything to help her. His shoulder was clearly causing him pain, but he bore it stoically, more concerned with her comfort than his own injury. Tell me about your sister, she said as they finished their meal. The one whose clothes I'm wearing. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that spoke of old pain. Her name was Michelle, he said finally. Michelle Thomas. She was 5 years younger than me, and the only family I had left after our parents died. What happened to her? She married a man not unlike your Robert, Anthony said, his voice growing hard. Someone who seemed charming and caring until after the wedding, when his true nature emerged. She tried to leave him several times, but he always found her, always convinced her to come back. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. And did they get different? For a while, maybe, but men like that don't really change. They just get better at hiding what they are. Anthony's hands clenched into fists. The last time she tried to leave, he killed her, made it look like an accident, but I knew better. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, understanding now why Anthony had been so willing to help her. I tried to get justice through the law, Anthony continued, but he had money and connections, just like your Robert. The authorities ruled it an accident, case closed. So it took matters into my own hands. Sarah looked at him with new understanding. That's why you came to live on the mountain. You were running too. Not running, Anthony corrected. Hiding? There's a difference. I did what needed to be done, but I knew there would be consequences. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself thinking about the parallels between her situation and that of Anthony's sister, about how many women might be trapped in similar circumstances with no way out. What will we do now? She asked eventually. That depends on what you want, Anthony replied. We could try to get you somewhere far away, somewhere your husband would never think to look. Or we could make a stand, try to end this once and for all. How would we end it? Anthony's smile was not pleasant. Men like Robert Brown understand only one kind of language. Sometimes you have to speak to them in terms they can comprehend. Sarah considered this, thinking about the life she had been living, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. The idea of being truly free, of not having to run anymore, was almost too wonderful to contemplate. What would that involve, she asked. It would involve going back to Denver, Anthony said. It would involve confronting Robert directly, making it clear that his hunting days are over. It would be dangerous, and there's no guarantee we'd survive it, but it would be a permanent solution. Sarah thought about this as she stared into the dancing flames. The woman who had been eating scraps from garbage bins just days ago would never have considered such a course of action. But the woman who had shot an armed man to save Anthony's life was someone different, someone stronger. I want to end it, she said finally. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. Anthony nodded as if he had expected this answer. It won't be easy. Robert has money and men, and he'll be expecting trouble now. But you have a plan. I have the beginning of a plan, Anthony corrected. The details will depend on what we find when we get to Denver. They spent the rest of the day resting and planning, with Anthony sharing what he knew about Robert Brown's business operations and personal habits. It became clear that Anthony had been gathering information about Sarah's husband even before she had arrived at his cabin. As night fell and they prepared to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few short days. She had gone from being a victim to being someone who was actively planning to take charge of her own destiny. Anthony, she said as they settled down for the night, sharing blankets near the fire for warmth. Whatever happens in Denver, I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope, Sarah replied. The belief that I can be something more than just a victim. Anthony was quiet for a moment. You were never just a victim, Sarah. You were always stronger than you knew. I just helped you remember it. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, warmed by the fire and by Anthony's presence beside her, she found herself looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than dreading them. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, perfect weather for the journey back down the mountain toward Denver and the confrontation that awaited them there. As they prepared to leave the mining camp, Sarah took one last look around the cabin that had provided them shelter and safety, knowing that when she saw it again, if she ever did, she would be a different person entirely. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard travel through mountain passes that tested both their endurance and their resolve. Anthony knew trails that avoided the main roads, paths that had been used by miners and trappers for decades but were unknown to casual travelers. Sarah found herself growing stronger with each mile they traveled, her body adapting to the physical demands of mountain travel and her mind focusing on the task ahead. The pistol Anthony had given her had become a familiar weight in her coat pocket, and she no longer flinched at the memory of using it to save his life. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered grove of aspens, Anthony began teaching her more advanced techniques with firearms, showing her how to reload quickly, how to aim effectively at longer distances, and how to move and shoot simultaneously. You're a natural, Anthony observed as she hit a series of targets he had set up. Most people take weeks to develop that kind of accuracy. I have good motivation, Sarah replied, thinking of Robert and the years of fear and pain he had inflicted on her. By the time they reached the outskirts of Denver, Sarah felt like a completely different person from the desperate woman who had fled the city just weeks before. She carried herself differently now, with confidence rather than fear, and there was steel in her eyes that had not been there before. Denver was a bustling city, full of people and noise and the constant activity of commerce and industry. After days in the mountain wilderness, the crowds and buildings felt overwhelming, but Sarah forced herself to adapt. Anthony had contacts in the city, men who owed him favors from his mining days, and who were willing to provide information and assistance without asking too many questions. Through these contacts, they learned that Robert had indeed hired additional men to search for Sarah, and that he was offering an even larger reward for her capture. But they also learned something more interesting. Robert's business was in trouble, with several major deals falling through and creditors beginning to press for payment. He's desperate, Anthony explained as they studied the information they had gathered. Men like Robert base their entire sense of self-worth on their ability to control others. Losing you, having you escape his control, has probably driven him to the edge of madness. Add financial pressure to that, and he's likely to make mistakes. What kind of mistake? The kind that give us opportunities, Anthony replied with a grim smile. Their plan, when it finally took shape, was both simple and audacious. Rather than trying to avoid Robert or hide from his searching men, they would force a direct confrontation on their own terms. Anthony would use his contacts to spread word that Sarah had returned to Denver and was hiding in a specific location, a warehouse district on the edge of town that had been chosen for its isolation and tactical advantages. "You'll be the bait," Anthony explained, as they went over the plan one final time. "Robert will come himself, probably with several men, thinking he has you trapped. But we'll be ready for him." Sarah nodded, understanding her role in what was to come. The idea of using herself as bait should have been terrifying, but instead she felt a cold determination settling over her like armor. The warehouse Anthony had chosen was perfect for their purposes, a large building with multiple entrances and exits, plenty of cover, and clear sight lines that would allow them to control the engagement. Anthony had spent hours studying the building and the surrounding area, positioning supplies and weapons at strategic points. As the sun began to set on what would either be the last day of her old life or simply the last day of her life, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. "Anthony, she said as they made their final preparations, I need you to know something." "What's that?" "If we don't survive this, if something goes wrong, I want you to know that these past few days have been the best of my life. Not because of the danger or the violence, but because for the first time in years, I've felt like myself again." Anthony stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "Sarah, we are going to survive this, both of us. And when we do, you're going to have the rest of your life to discover just how much you're worth." The first sign that Robert had taken the bait came just after darkness fell, when Anthony's lookouts reported movement in the streets surrounding the warehouse. Multiple vehicles were converging on the area, and armed men were taking positions around the building's perimeter. "He's here," Anthony said, checking his weapons one final time. "Are you ready?" Sarah drew her pistol and checked the action, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to face. "I'm ready." The warehouse had been transformed into a fortress, with overturned machinery providing cover and strategic positions, offering clear fields of fire toward all the entrances. They didn't have to wait long. Robert's voice echoed through the warehouse as he called out from somewhere near the main entrance. "Sarah, I know you're in there. This has gone on long enough. Come out now, and I promise I won't hurt your friend." Sarah felt a familiar chill at the sound of Robert's voice, the same fear that had controlled her life for so long. But now, instead of paralyzing her, the fear transformed into something else: cold, focused anger. "I'm not hiding anymore, Robert," she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. "If you want me, come and get me." There was a moment of silence, and then Robert's laughter echoed through the building, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Sarah. But you can't hide behind your mountain man forever." "Then what are you waiting for?" Sarah replied, and she could hear the steel in her own voice. The assault began moments later, with Robert's men attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. But Anthony had anticipated this, and their defensive positions had been chosen to funnel the attackers into predetermined killing zones. The battle that followed was fierce but brief, with Anthony's tactical expertise and Sarah's newfound skill proving more than a match for Robert's hired thugs. When the shooting finally stopped, several of Robert's men lay wounded or dead, and the rest had retreated. "Robert," Anthony called out during the lull, "your men are dying for your wounded pride. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," Robert's voice came back, filled with rage and desperation, "is my property returned to me. Sarah belongs to me, and I'll kill anyone who tries to keep her from me." "I don't belong to anyone," Sarah shouted back, her voice ringing with conviction. "I never did, and I never will." The final confrontation came not as Sarah and Anthony had planned it, but as a desperate gambit by a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Robert Brown appeared suddenly in the warehouse's main doorway, not with an army of hired guns, but alone, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his face haggard with exhaustion and madness. In his hands, he carried a rifle, and his eyes held the wild gleam of someone who had crossed the line from determination into obsession. "Enough!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. "Enough of this game, Sarah. You're coming home with me tonight, even if I have to drag your corpse." Sarah stepped out from behind her cover, Anthony moving to flank her, both of them with weapons trained on the man who had terrorized her for so long. But now, seeing Robert in the harsh light of the warehouse's industrial lamps, Sarah realized how diminished he appeared. Gone was the imposing figure who had dominated her life through fear and violence. In his place stood a broken man whose world had crumbled around him. "Look at yourself, Robert," Sarah said, her voice steady and calm. "Look at what you've become. You've lost everything chasing after something that was never yours to begin with." "You were mine," Robert snarled, raising his rifle. "You promised to love, honor, and obey. Those vows meant something." "They meant something to me too," Sarah replied. "But you broke them first, every time you raised your hand to me. Every time you treated me like property instead of a person." Robert's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Anthony stepped forward. "It's over, Brown. Your men are dead or gone, your business is ruined, and you're alone. Walk away now and you might live to see morning." "I'd rather die than let her go," Robert said, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he meant it. "Then that's your choice," Anthony replied calmly. What happened next unfolded with terrible inevitability. Robert swung his rifle towards Sarah, his face twisted with hatred and madness, his finger squeezing the trigger. But Sarah was no longer the terrified woman who had cowered before his rage. She moved with the fluid grace Anthony had taught her, stepping aside as she drew her pistol in one smooth motion. Two shots rang out simultaneously in the warehouse, the reports echoing off the metal walls like thunder. Robert's bullet went wide, missing Sarah by inches and sparking off a steel beam behind her. Sarah's shot found its mark, striking Robert's center mass and sending him staggering backward. Robert looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then back at Sarah, his expression one of complete bewilderment. "You shot me," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "Yes," Sarah replied, her weapon still trained on him. "I did." Robert took another step backward, then another, before his legs gave out and he collapsed to the warehouse floor. Sarah approached him cautiously, Anthony beside her, both ready for any final trick. But there was no fight left in Robert Brown. "Why, boy," he whispered as Sarah knelt beside him. "Why couldn't you just be what I needed you to be?" Sarah looked down at the man who had made her life a nightmare for so long and felt something she had not expected. Pity. "Because what you needed wasn't a wife, Robert. It was a slave, and I was never going to be that." Robert's eyes glazed over and his breathing stopped. The man who had hunted her across hundreds of miles was dead. And with his death, Sarah felt a weight she had carried for years finally lift from her shoulders. "It's over," Anthony said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Yes," Sarah agreed, rising to her feet and looking around the warehouse that had been the site of her final battle for freedom. "It's over." The aftermath was surprisingly simple. Anthony's contacts helped them deal with the legal complications, and Robert's death was ruled self-defense. Sarah found herself a wealthy woman, inheriting Robert's estate, though she had little interest in money built on others' suffering. Instead, she used her resources to help other women in similar situations, establishing safe houses and legal aid funds. But more important than the money was the transformation she had undergone. The frightened woman eating scraps had become someone strong and confident, someone who could face the world on her own terms. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah found herself back on Anthony's mountain, helping him rebuild the cabin that had been damaged in the first battle. The work was hard but satisfying, and Sarah discovered that she had developed a taste for the simple pleasures of mountain life. "Do you miss it?" Anthony asked one evening as they sat on the rebuilt porch, watching the sun set over the peaks. "The city, I mean." Sarah considered the question seriously. I miss some things, she said. Books, music, the convenience of having everything within walking distance. But I don't miss the fear. I don't miss looking over my shoulder every time I leave the house. And now? Mom, I know that I can handle whatever comes, Sarah replied. Not because I'm not afraid, but because I've learned that being afraid doesn't have to mean being helpless. Anthony nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. So what happens now? Do you stay here? Or do you go back to the world and use your newfound strength to change it? Sarah smiled, looking out at the mountain wilderness that had become her sanctuary and her proving ground. I think, she said, that I'll do both. This mountain will always be my home, the place where I learned who I really am. But there are other women out there who need to learn the same lesson. And you'll help them find it. We'll help them find it, Sarah corrected, taking Anthony's hand in hers. If you're willing. Anthony squeezed her hand gently, his dark eyes warm with affection and respect. I can't think of anything I'd rather do. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with desperation and hunger, with a woman so broken by abuse that she had been reduced to eating scraps from a stranger's garbage. But that moment of desperate need had led to something neither she nor Anthony could have anticipated, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose, a love that had grown from understanding rather than need. The mountain wind sighed through the pines around them, carrying with it the promise of adventures yet to come, of lives yet to be changed, of strength yet to be discovered. Sarah Carter had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined, and now she was ready to help others make the same discovery. The woman who had once eaten scraps in the darkness behind a cabin now sat beside the man who had offered to share his table, planning how they would share their strength with a world that desperately needed it. It was, Sarah thought, a much better ending than she had ever dared to hope for when she first heard those words that had changed her life forever. Let's eat together tonight.